Welcome back to Debut Writers. In episode 2, we are diving into the critical first steps of crafting your manuscript. Today, we'll explore the age old debate of planning versus pantsing, deciding whether to meticulously outline your story or dive right into the writing process. Establishing your unique writing pattern is key not only to completing your debut novel, but to also shaping your journey as an author.
Every writer certainly develops their own ritual for tackling that initial manuscript. Finding your writing groove is essential for finishing not just your first book, but for sustaining your creative process across future books and projects. So let's start at the beginning. Do you outline your story meticulously, or do you prefer to let that story unfold organically as you write?
So, Brie, I recently learned about the terms like planner versus pantser.
Or
And
plotter?
yes, and I actually was kind of connecting with the writing community on Twitter the other day, asking them, what their opinion is, knowing this episode was coming up. And one of the authors said she prefers to call it a discoverer. So, like, it's basically pantsing, but instead of just like flying by the seat of your pants, it's really as you're writing, you're now discovering the story, you're discovering the characters. And honestly, sometimes as a debut author or a debut writer, that can be the best thing for you because at generally, like, I had an idea of what a lost woman was supposed to be. I had kind of the overall arching plot that I was going to do. But as I wrote the story, the characters really did surprise me. And then the twist at the end, which I always knew was going to be the twist, it felt so much more, it landed so much better though at the end of the day, because I really, with that in the back of my mind, as the characters evolved and the story evolved, it really all came to that point. So I had that like vision of where it was going, but so many surprises in that novel. I still will go back and read parts of that novel and be like, I wrote that.
That's amazing. I was just talking with an author yesterday too, who's definitely a pantser for both of the books that she's written. But I love hearing when people talk about how the characters really let the story unfold and how they could just hear their voices and see what was going on and the surprises that came up along the way that they weren't expecting. So, but let's talk about both because I will say neither one is wrong. Like they both have so many benefits, and a lot of it is going to come down to finding what works for you as a writer and an author. But let's talk about the pros and cons because, as with everything, there are pros and then there are some
Yes.
downsides to those things. So, should we start with the outliners, the people that plot?
Yeah, let's start there because I feel like when you take the time to outline, instead of just doing it in your head, you actually like sit down and you write it out and you talk about, okay, what each chapter is going to be. You can, that's kind of a pantsing moment. I mean, you're really kind of like, as I'm thinking about, okay, well, what's happening next? What's happening next? The story is still having like this natural development for me. So there's a space of pantsing within the outlining, if that makes sense. And what I really liked about it was now when I start writing, like I said, I know where I'm going. I've got this like roadmap for my story, which can be incredibly helpful. With a lost woman, without that roadmap, it went a little kinky and winky sometimes. And the editing process was extremely extensive. Versus if you outline the novel and you have a really, really solid clarity and focus, structure, organization, all that stuff is going to lead to having very little outlining. I mean, you're still going to have to edit and revise your book, of course, that never goes away. But when you have a really strong, cohesive story, I think that that editing process is not so intense. As the acquisitions director and now as the associate editor for Indigo River, as I'm reading these novels, there's some where it's like very clear that this author knew exactly where the story was going. It's very strong, it's put together very nicely versus a story that's kind of all over the place. And I'm like, I can tell the difference and I can see I edited one of my first books. I was like, we're going to need like a lot. Like, let's just start with maybe these two things, but this is only the beginning because there's like 10 things we need to be addressing. But we're only going to start with a couple. Never address all the things in the first edit, FYI. And but then I just read this other book and I was like, I mean, it's pretty solid. I mean, aside from like this point and this point, like you got this. And so that editing process is going to be much quicker for him. So I think that that's one of the huge benefits of outlining really meticulously and having a strong outline that you stick with is you've kind of worked out all those plot holes, all the inconsistencies really early on so then they don't flow over to that writing process.
Yeah, I would say too, and I think it applies even more depending on the genre of your book. But if you are
Mhm.
writing a psychological thriller or some sort of mystery, things like that, think about all of the red herrings and things that need to be incorporated into a story like that. And I think it's a lot harder to incorporate those when you don't think about them and you just fly by the seat of your pants and you're like, yeah, we'll get there. But
Yeah.
those have to be strategically placed throughout your story. So even, and we'll talk a little bit about it, but Jenny Meyer Sane, who writes in that space for YA, she told me once that she was like, I consider myself a plantser because I
Mm.
plan the key things, but then I kind of pants the rest of it. But she does think about those. She thinks about those big reveals that happen and the little things that she needs to leave behind because she knows those need to be placed in certain spaces. So consider your genre as well. And if you need to include some of those things at certain moments within your story, like is it going to be even more beneficial to outline those ahead of time?
Something that would be really good is to grab the book, Save the Cat Writes a Novel.
I was thinking so.
It is such a great book for, developing your writing and knowing. It also does these 10 genres. So it's like, and they're not your mother's genres, I think is what she calls it. But it really goes into there's only 10 different types of stories. And if that's your type of story, like if you're a mystery, if you're a rite of passage, like you've got to have certain things in your story and then you've got to have them placed at certain points in your story. So you can look at one of the chapters in Save the Cat is all about the beats, like when you should be talking about certain stuff, when certain things should happen in your novel. Like within the first 12% of your novel, this needs to happen. Within the first 50%, 75, 99. So it can really, if you get that basic, like, pacing outline, that could be extremely helpful for you too. In fact, Bree, I can post that to our newsletter so you can kind of see the space, the pacing of what your novel should be like. And it's true for every novel that you're going to write. Even nonfiction, there's still certain things you need to be doing throughout the process of the book. So again, outlining can really help with that because then like this is what I'm doing here. This is what I'm doing here. It's very meticulous. You've got your pacing. Another thing that outlining really can help with, because I think I mentioned this before, but I was contracted to write a novel before and I had to outline it to get it approved. And that was my really first experience outlining. I had been a pantser to that point, but I really enjoyed it because I was basically like fast writing the novel with this outline because I wrote each chapter title and then like kind of a blurb of what would happen in that chapter. I'm developing the characters during that time. I'm kind of seeing the scenes in my mind, but I'm not having to slow down and write all that out. So outlining sometimes can be like the fast-paced pantser. I
Yeah,
guess like you're really getting through the story fast.
I agree with that. It to me, it just gives you such direction and helps you stay focused on that. I know we're talking about novels, but I'm even thinking, so I ghostwrite monthly, typically for a couple of different journals and magazines and different articles. And even for those, oftentimes I'm given the topic, but then from there I kind of have free reign. But I will, even in the shortest of things, outline just, okay, I've got to hit this point, then this point, this one, and this one, and then wrap it up. And that gives you so much direction to really flow through that. And then, yeah, pants the article. Like I can knock out that article if I've got my 5 bullet points of where this needs to go and what they want to see, and then I can knock it out.
Yeah. And also, when you're doing that outlining, that character development sometimes can be there. You can really take the time to not just to outline your story, but outline your characters. I've actually found that extremely helpful. And it's one of the first things I really have my authors do when I'm coaching them is okay, who are your main characters? Let's talk about them. I want you to know them like you know your best friend, like you know yourself. So, like, give me all the deets, spill the tea on this character, So, you really, even if that stuff isn't necessarily brought into the novel, it's understanding your character. I think we've talked before about how
Yeah.
I honestly kind of assign every character to somebody I know. And I give them that name because it kind of helps me remember, okay, like every time Chelsea comes into the story, I know exactly what that character's doing because I've mirrored her off of one of my best friends, Chelsea. Now I'm changing all of that when the story comes out. So you don't really know who I'm talking about unless you're that person. Sometimes they do pick up on it, but it can be really helpful to sit down and take the time to truly understand your characters and their quirks. Like, does this character always like you see it like, play with their cuticles or bite their lip or twirl their hair? Like these little things just bring the character to life more for the reader.
Absolutely. It makes me think back to a conversation I had with Allison Larkin last year, actually. But this was one example that we had talked about is thinking about your characters and if they came in with a bag, what's in that bag? What kind of bag is it?
Mhm.
Do they have a backpack? Is it a satchel? What are they carrying? And then what's in it? What's in that bag? Do they have a gum wrapper in their pocket? So you need to intimately know who those characters are in order for your readers to understand them and understand their motivations and the quirks and what makes them tick. You need to know that as a writer too.
Yes. And also, I think this is a really strong point to make in this episode. Just because you outline a story and just because you develop a character does not mean they can't change.
Right.
Um, so when you're pantsing a novel, kind of shifting gears into pantsing that novel, which if you don't know, that means flying by the seat of your pants. You're just kind of like going with the story. It really allows, a lot of people say that that allows the story to develop more organically, and it can lead to surprising twists and turns that you never really considered. So many writers, if you follow them on like Instagram or Twitter or something, they write these hilarious memes about how, they're writing in my character. I want him to say this, but he's refusing to. He's refusing to follow my directions, and this is what he's going to say instead. Or like, I really want my character to do A, but he's really wants to do B, so he's winning the battle right now. And it's so interesting to think of like, a writer basically having multiple
I
personalities
know.
in their mind because all these characters have their own personalities. So it allows you to really explore them a little bit more when you're pantsing and you don't have every tiny little thing. But I think outlining that character before and understanding that character, then as you write, allow that character to develop naturally. It's kind of this like hybrid between outlining and pantsing that can really help your characters feel more real and enriched. And so I think that that is something really strong to consider is know your character, but then also allow your character to drive that novel, talk to the character in your head. I think all writers are like a little bit.
They are. They're all having different conversations and seeing scenes and everything. But I agree with that. You really truly need to understand your characters and keep in mind too that once this book is done, people will ask you about them like they're real people.
Yes.
And so if you don't understand them, that's going to come through. I was at an author event recently and people were asking about it. And I host a podcast where we talk about characters like they're real people. And so you need to know that. You need to truly understand them like they are and ultimately what they're going through, the hurdles they're overcoming, their personalities are what's driving the story. So if they're bland and they have no development and no backstory, that's gonna end up hurting your novel. So on top of
And your
that, we kind of
character needs flaws.
they do. They're not perfect. I know it's so. Um, we talked like Outlining can help you be really efficient, really productive because you have an outline. You know where you're going, at least a little bit. Of course, giving yourself room to deviate and to pivot if something pops up,
Mhm.
but it does help with that. And you mentioned like the revision and editing process, which I think is just, I don't think it can be emphasized enough. um, so I'm just going to reiterate that because to me, that is a lot of authors, especially the first time, don't fully understand what that editing process is like. And
I had no clue. No clue.
it's um it's it can be very time consuming. And yeah, if there are a lot of plot holes, if there's a lot of inconsistency, if your book has said we before it has an identity crisis, like
Mhm.
the editing process is going to be a lot more time consuming. And that's okay. That's not a bad thing, but manage your expectations if you don't have it planned out. Um and it,
And this is Yeah, and
no
I
go ahead.
think this is why, like, we didn't start the series with write your book. We
Right.
started with, what do you need to do before you start writing your book? And it none of that really included outlining, but it did include knowing your purpose, knowing your goal with this book. Even if you're a pantser, you've got to have certain things in the back of your mind every time when you're sitting down to write. You've got to remember that purpose. You've got to remember that goal of this novel. You've got to remember who's your target audience because, again, that can lead to an identity crisis for your book. And you've put all this time and energy into writing the book, and it's not really what you wanted it to be. It's not going to go where you wanted it to go. Bree, how many authors do we meet that put their first book aside, put their second book aside, and then now it's their third book that finally gets that agent, that third book that's finally getting published because their books had identity crisis and it was really hard to find a place and a home for it.
Yeah, oh my goodness, all the time. Honestly, I'm shocked whenever I talk to someone and they're like, "Yeah, this was my first one." And I just think, "Really? Tell me your ways."
Yeah. Yeah, like, how did you get that first novel off the ground? Like, I sometimes look at A Lost Woman and I think to myself, I 100% knew my book had an identity crisis because when people are like, "Well, what genre does it sit in?" I was like,
Uh,
That's a good question. What are the genres again? No.
I was I
I
was
was like,
talking
I don't know where it sits. I have no idea.
I was just having a conversation with someone who working on their first book, and I we didn't have a ton of time to talk, and we were like in space for something totally different and unrelated, but they're going, I go, "Oh, what genre is it?" And they're like, "Well, it's a little bit fantasy, mystery, historical
Mhm,
fiction." Yeah. And I was like, "Well, if it's okay, historical fiction and fantasy, like those don't
mhm.
those are tough ones, tough one to tie together."
Yeah.
So uh, it is. That's kind of why we never wanted to start with, okay, let's write your book. There are things to think about beforehand if you can, or if you're in those early stages to think about. So let's okay, keep going. Let's talk about some of the benefits of pantsing the novel. You touched on a few, like the creative, being really spontaneous as you're writing, this organic, the characters are truly driving it. Like I mentioned, I love listening to authors when they really can speak to how they pants a novel, and they can
Mhm.
talk about beginning to end, how the characters really led them on that journey. I think it is so special and so neat when that happens. um, I would say that a lot of them, not all of them, but they can start to pants when they've already developed a book before and have
Mhm.
more experience with that. I think it's a little bit easier to pants a novel once you have one under your belt.
Yes, especially if we've talked about this before, as a writer, having your pattern, because with readers are going to want that. Like, I have some of my favorite authors, all their books are basically the same. Like, they just change the setting, the characters, and maybe the murder happens in a different way. But think of romance novels too. They all follow this pattern. And again, with Saves the Cat, you'll see that in those genres that there's certain patterns that have to happen that follow each different genre. So it's one of those things where it's like you've got to make sure that with pantsing, you've got all this stuff in the back of your mind, but I really do love when the characters drive the story. And sometimes as a debut writer, you need that. You need to
Yeah.
kind of find your voice. And that's what pantsing can really help you do. I have a my best friend, her daughter is so lovely. And she just texted me her first chapter. She's in eighth grade and she's like so inspired to write this novel about her going to camp this summer. And I'm like, let's go, girl, let's do it. I'm so
What?
excited for her. But just in the first chapter, she had such a strong voice.
Oh,
Of course, it was her voice. And I'm like, keep to that. Don't lose that. Like, you're in her mind and like she's asking questions and it's very written to, her age level because that's her mind. But I really did enjoy reading it because she had such a strong voice out the gate. And you can't outline voice. So, and voice is probably one of the most important things. If you write the same book over and over again, if you outline, if you pants, whatever you determine your process to be, voice is probably the most important thing. And I remember after I wrote A Lost Woman, super green, and I'm like querying agents, and they would tell me, they were like, you have a strong voice, or I like your voice. And I'm thinking, like, we didn't even talk.
uh,
Like, I'm gonna have to Google that. So I didn't even realize what I was doing, but like, it was like there was like a voice in there, and I was like, oh, okay, it's based. And someone told me, they're like, I feel like Nora's my best friend because like I feel like I'm in her mind and she's like talking, telling the story to her best friend. Like that's the voice that it had. And so I think that pantsing, one of the big benefits of that is that freedom to explore and develop your voice.
yeah, naturally, which
Mhm.
is which is really nice. And you're right. I mean, eventually, and here's the thing, there's nothing wrong with writing to the tropes and everything in the romance genre. Like there's nothing wrong with that. But you want it to stand out too. You want it to be yours with all of that. So finding how you can say it is really important. And there are different ways to do that, but I do agree that pantsing is a really, really way to naturally figure out what that looks like.
Another thing about pantsing is the emotional connection a writer can really sometimes develop when you are just kind of feeling the story. You're kind of letting it lead you, the characters lead you. It kind of deepens your emotional connection to the story and can heighten your sense of empathy and investment into the journey as well, too. I think I've said this before, but like my grandfather died when I was writing A Lost Woman, and spoiler alert, there's a death, and she dies in A Lost Woman. And I really was so in that moment and in my feelings when I wrote that scene, and people have commented very frequently on that scene that it felt so raw and so real, and they really, they really could understand what Nora was going through. And I'm like, well, I was kind of going through it myself. I was kind of like, you're processing that too. So sometimes allowing, having those opportunities too, put yourself in that character, put yourself in what they're going through. And we all write characters, and there's somehow versions and spaces of us, right? Where if that character's going through a loss, what was the time you went through a loss? Go back, pull on that emotion and bring it in, because the more you can write what you know and be real, honestly, I mean, it's age old because it's true. I mean, I found the parts of my book that are the most me are the parts that readers have connected with the most.
Absolutely. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. The more you feel it while you're writing it, the more your reader is going to feel it too. And no matter what your genre is, you want them to be transported while they're reading it to that space or time or relating to that character and whatever they're going through. And the more you're doing that in that moment and really letting it take over, the more your readers are going to feel that too. And they're going to relate to that character. They're going to shed a tear. I mean, I always think about whenever I'm like crying while I read a book, I'm always like, the author must have been sobbing as they
Yeah.
wrote this. Because if I am just beside myself right now, then they had to have been truly feeling it so deeply. And then I've heard authors talk about that. Like, yeah, while I wrote that, I it was really hard. It was hard to push through, but I wanted to feel that while I wrote it. And so being able to do that, pantsing is a great way to do it. And I think if you're outlining, just know that you're going to have to get into that headspace at that point
Mhm.
in time.
Yeah, I think it's Colleen Hoover. You know, she'd been an author for 12 years. She had all these books out. And then, I mean, of course, we all know her name now. I mean, It Ends With Us was huge, huge. And I actually listened to that book. And so at the end, it automatically like clicked me over to the author's note in the back. And if you didn't read it, definitely go back and read it. It goes into how her parents were abusive towards each other and they got a divorce, and it made it where she was able to have a true relationship with both of her parents. So much of that story, I mean, just by like hearing that, I was like, okay, so much of this story was what you've experienced, what you believe, what you feel so strongly about. This is why this book made a difference. This is why this book resonated with so many people and why people recommended it. Word of mouth. If somebody feels something for your book, inspired, moved, changed, they are going to recommend your book. So this is, something you really want to ensure you have. And sometimes pantsing can really get you there.
Absolutely. So, what if you don't know? What if you don't know if you're a planner or pantser or this is your first book? What's the recommendation?
I would say try it all. I mean, do like a hybrid, in my opinion. Like outline it, but don't be rigid in the outline. Pants it, but have like an idea of what's happening. Like, like I said, like I knew what the twist was going to be at the end. I knew what the end game was for my story. I knew its purpose. I knew the goal. Like I had these certain things that were concrete about the book, right? And then I started writing. So I think that the best is kind of a happy medium between the two, that hybrid approach, especially as a debut writer, because it'll help you with your natural storytelling, finding that voice, letting the story kind of develop organically if you're struggling. But if you find yourself being really inconsistent and you find yourself, I don't know what should happen next, or when should this happen in my story, or should this character do this or that, go back to that beginning stage and say, okay, let me look at this outline. Let me look at the story beats. When should this be happening? Let me go look at my character development. And if I didn't do it, maybe go back and do it and say, okay, if I'm not really sure what this character is going to do, then I need to know them a little bit better. And so you can kind of shift back and forth. And with this first book, you're really finding your process, what works best for you. So try it all, just give it a go, figure out what's going to be the best for you, because this is going to be your writing process, not ours. So like you've got to figure out what's going to be the best for you.
Ab- uh, Absolutely. Like, if there is a takeaway, it's that you have to figure out what works best for you. And sometimes that's trying different things. That's trying to plot it, that's trying to pants it, that's trying a combination. Listen to other authors talk about it. I mean, so many authors, either on their website or on podcasts and other ways, will talk about what their process is. Know that you're finding yours. And so I think it's great to listen to how other people craft it, but no author is the exact same in how they do it. And some listen to music, some don't. Some pants the entire novel, some plot the entire thing with the sticky note method, and they know every single detail that's going to happen. You need to figure out what works for you and is going to get you to the finish line. And there are benefits to all of it. There are pros and cons. And so I think it's good to just be realistic so that you know come the next phase what you're up against.
Yeah. And in the next episode, we're going to be talking about writer's block or fatigue, because now we've talked about like what kind of the process you're going to go through. But as you're writing this novel, you will get stuck, even with a very meticulous outline. I assure you, you'll get stuck, or you'll get lost, or you'll get tired, or you'll step away and not realize that you are deep cleaning your house to avoid writing, which is if I'm deep cleaning my house, I'm avoiding writing. I'm like, oh my gosh, I really need to be writing. So next episode, we're going to really tackle that, talk about how to keep the pace going, how to stay on schedule, and some of the things you can do to prevent that book from kind of dying midway through.
Absolutely. So make sure that you subscribe on YouTube as well as our Substack newsletter so that not only can you get some additional tips, but you don't miss that next episode because we all get it. Writer's block happens and we want to keep up the pace and finish that book.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Debut Writers. Make sure to check out our newsletter for your 3 T's and subscribe to never miss an empowering conversation.
Stay inspired and keep writing.